We're here to talk about learning analytics, and very excited to do so. Our session, Learning Analytics, Capturing, Analyzing, and Visualizing Lifelong Learning, is one of the presidential sessions. We want to thank Barbara Schneider and all of AERA for having us here to talk about this. And I have with me my terrific panelists, Ed Dieterle, John Behrens from Pearson, Ryan Baker from Teachers College, Marie Bienkowski from SRI International, and Governor Bob Wise from the Alliance for Excellent Education. So we want to get started today really by setting the frame of this. We've had a lot going on in the past couple of years about learning analytics, big data, education. We want to set the framing of this for what's the vision? Why are we here? Why do we care about this? And so we'll start with this quick video.
I'm on my computer a lot.
Email,
Google Docs,
Google Search, Snapchat.
Technology has revolutionized our world. We can connect and learn and create and share. We have immediate, improved, and personalized access to the world.
Google.
Nothing in our modern lives remains untouched by this powerful transformation, except for education. The big idea behind blended learning is combining online learning and brick-and-mortar schools with teachers where students can learn at their own pace so that they can optimize their individual learning.
Combining the best of teacher instruction and computer-based instruction.
The world that we live in today isn't about paper and pencil, it's about computers. Having our kids become comfortable and familiar with that now is going to better prepare them for the world when they leave this school.
Blended learning can actually personalize for every student's individual needs to meet them where they are when they need it.
We are doing students and ourselves a great disservice to assume they all learn in the same way, so we need something new, and that's blended learning.
When you walk into a blended learning school, what you'll see is small groups of students off with their computers working away on online learning programs, and another group of students in small groups doing rich interactive projects with each other and really collaborating as peers.
I'm able to now focus on smaller groups of kids, give them more individual attention, and help them with their individual learning styles.
Before, you're moving at the pace of the average of your 30 kids. Now you can really move at the pace of each individual student.
The teacher has the opportunity to look at data in the moment, in the minute, to know where our kids are immediately, informs instruction in the next period or the next morning.
In a regular classroom, it might take a week for you to get your test back. I can take a test twice in one class, get my feedback almost instantly, and figure out what I need to improve on.
Blended learning makes you in charge of your pathway, knowing how to navigate what you need and when you need it.
And that's true learning and knowledge. It's when you're able to apply content into real life.
All 50 million of America's students deserve the opportunity to have blended learning so that they can personalize their education and realize success in life.
50 million.
50 million students.
50 million students.
50 million.
50 million students in America.
In America.
50 million students in America.
So we'll get going, and I invite you to join us today in thinking about the challenges and opportunities that are available and going on in achieving that vision. John Behrens.
Thank you, Taylor. The work I'm going to discuss today is collaborative work with Kristen DeSerbo, and it's around this concept of the digital ocean that I'll be talking about. There is a hashtag for the conversation about that, and you'll see more about the details as we go. A couple thank yous. I want to thank Ed Dieterle for inviting me. I want to thank Ed again for suggesting that I emphasize the Digital Ocean paper that we recently launched. Thanks for Taylor for organizing. I'll be thanking the BBC Dancing Goat, who you'll learn more about later in the presentation, and for Pearson for supporting the work. So the goal for today is really to spend some time questioning our fundamental assumptions about educational data and inference. I'm not going to show you any formulas, not going to show you any data, well, maybe a little, but it's really an epistemological discussion about the social cultural change that we're in. I go to many sessions and I ask people, what is data? And I'm always surprised to find that graduate students, professors, policymakers, many people haven't ever spent time thinking about what they mean when they say data. It's very important, but we don't think much about it. For me, data are records of experience. This is an expression from John Tukey. And data analysis is simply learning from records of experience. And Tukey wrote this way back in 1966, but it's even more true today because we have video as data, we have photographs as data, we have what the students in the blended learning video shared as data. Data are many, many forms of records of experience in ways we could not even imagine 20 or 30 years ago. In our work in the Center for Digital Data Analytics and Adaptive Learning at Pearson, we think about human history in two phases. In our early phase, our relationship to data was around instrumenting students and learners and collecting that data. We call this phase the digital desert. This is a pre-digital phase where it was very expensive to collect data. You had to stop the instruction to collect the data. You had to create artificial situations to instrument the students. This is how testing has been evolved. In the current evolving environment of which we saw examples in that video, there's a new paradigm of generating and capturing natural data from learning. It's not as intrusive, it's taking advantage of what's generated in the natural learning process or the natural educational process or the natural exploratory process. We call this the digital ocean. If you're data, this is a happy world to be in. The idea of the digital ocean is that not that we want to force more data collection or we want to force more testing, but that our natural activity is increasingly digital. And if we can harness that activity in natural ways, perhaps we can collect and use data in natural feedback loops that are less intrusive and more natural. This is an example, for instance, of SimCity EDU, which is a large online game that's designed with assessment from the start, has lots of complex assessment evidence collection that goes in the back. Natural feedback occurs through the system. It's very play-like, and it's an important genre that's emerging. In data collection and analysis, we see a shift as illustrated by this kind of game. New types of data, a shift from digital desert data in which scoring was so expensive we had to restrict the kinds of responses that we could get from the students, to new kinds of data in which complex scoring of the type Ryan might talk about or does in his professional work can be used to extract important patterns that we can't see in the old kinds of data on the left. This leads to new types of understandings and a shift from an item paradigm to an activity paradigm, from items posing questions to activities requesting activities, from answers to features, from correctness to attributes, from items focusing on very specific detailed information to items providing complex multidimensional information, as we saw in the game. And new forms of data in the wild, not just new forms of educational activities, but new forms of daily digital activities, which include learning and exploration and natural data generation. And as some of my favorite authors have recently written, the availability of data from everyday activities should fundamentally change how we think about learning and assessment. Now, this is one of my favorite activities in the world right now in the digital ocean. This is Dance Mat Typing. This is a BBC online free typing game. And the reason I love this is because it's, to me, kind of prototypical of what's possible in the digital ocean. I know this because my children would rush home from very rich, enjoyable lively Montessori classrooms so that they could get on the computer and do dance mat typing. When they type, the dancing goat periodically jumps up, does a little dance. You see, you get some sheep dance as well, very nice. And my daughter would run home and would love to do this. She would type, it would give her feedback, she would learn to type, it would assess her typing, and she thought it was a game. She had great fun, but the data of her performance stayed in that little application. In our imagination about the future of the digital ocean, she could press a button at the end that would say, "Send this to my school so my teacher knows what I'm doing." It wouldn't be obtrusive, it wouldn't be required, but it would be a way to share the activity outside of the class in the digital ocean with the stewards of learning inside the class of the digital ocean. This is the kind of vision we say, a world in which data are a side effect, not the primary goal of interesting and motivating activity, and perhaps a world where testing is a rare event, but assessment is in the water. So she's interacting with the dancing goat because she wants to, and she wants to learn typing, and it assesses her and gives her feedback. There's an underlying structure to these kind of software. They decide what to recommend next. They give you an interaction, the data is collected, some performance pattern is reflected, and the profile is updated. This is a general pattern discussed in the paper and has lots of implications for the unification of how we think about activity. I want to just remind us that it's not really just about data, but that data analysis is a human activity. And there's this waterfall of activity that happens in data and inference. And at each one of those links, the link from the world to the data, which is just a symbol, to the analysis, to the interpretation, to the communication, at each one of those links is a social activity where there's some degradation or dispersion of meaning. So there's many ways that we need to be careful and many ways in which we can go wrong in how we use data. So to summarize, a contrast between data that's alone and discrete, requested and pre-made, versus data that's linked and broad, generated, coming from in vivo tasks of many forms and over different activities and time. This challenges our existing categories because when the students are engaged in these inviting environments that engage them in learning and draw them into learning, but also produce data that provides assessment and feedback, is it curriculum or assessment? Is it games or instruction? Is it formal or informal? Is it formative or summative? Schooling or education, in school or out of school? Many of these distinctions are pre-digital distinctions that we need to rethink in a world where the data from playing on the computer after school can be linked with the data at the school and the stewards of learning. So then for us, the biggest challenge is not how to create the world with new technology, but to reinvent our conceptualizations to take advantage of a digital-first world. Thank you.
So I'll say a few words about some of the demonstrations that there are for the value of learning analytics for education. These days, an increasing amount of learning takes place in online learning environments like the blended learning environments and the dancing goat we saw. Here are a few examples. You might have students learning physics in a simulation microworld where they can change variables and see what happens, like the top left, Inkits. Or they might be doing it in a game like Newton's Playground, where they have to use physics operations and things like levers to get the ball to a goal. They might be learning about ecology in a simulation like virtual performance assessments up top center, where they are going around a world and picking up frogs and taking them to the lab and examining them. They might learn mathematics in a game-like environment like Reasoning Mind, or they might learn it in online homework problems like in the assessment system. This generates massive amounts of data. And there are communities in the research world emerging to study that data, including the Educational Data Mining Society and the Society for Learning Analytics Research. In recent years, these communities have led the way in researching a range of aspects of learners, including trying to model students' knowledge, their metacognition, their engagement, and their affect in real time. And these models increasingly work in a fashion that's, first of all, automated, able to make assessments about students in real time with no human being in the loop, so it can then provide that information back. Fine-grained, able to make assessments about students second by second. Validated, these models have been increasingly demonstrated to apply to entirely new students, new contexts, new populations. And predictive of student outcomes over the long term, which is good because then we can give teachers, school guidance counselors, parents information that is not just actionable and not just immediate, but also relates to the student's long-term outcomes. I'd like to give a few examples of this. A first example would be that Corbett and Anderson found that learning measured in online learning systems correlates to post-test performance. They then used that to lead to automated mastery learning, which was shown to improve student learning, even at relatively large scales, and to predict standardized exam scores. Help-seeking behaviors in online learning systems have been shown to correlate to performance outside the system, which leads to systems that teach more appropriate help-seeking behaviors, leading to lasting improvement in help-seeking. And knowing which behaviors correlate to the learning that students take out of the system helps us to make systems that adapt to the right behaviors. We know what to focus on. Gaming a system in online learning correlates to pre-post learning gains, and that leads to automated agents that respond when students game, where students misuse the system to get through that learning and improve student learning. Boredom correlates to not just post-test but midterm score. And boredom and gaming the system are associated with lower standardized exam scores. Going a little further here, we're not just looking at something right after the student uses a learning system, but kind of at the end of year exam. In fact, boredom and gaming the system in middle school mathematics are negatively associated with whether students will attend college. And it turns out that whether a student games the system to try to get through that learning in their middle school math homework is a better predictor of whether students are going to go to college than whether they miss class. And you might say, why? Well, there's a lot of reasons why students can miss class. They could be ill, there could be family issues, but whether a student is not taking their math learning seriously in math class every day is a pretty good indicator. And from blended learning systems, we have the ability to look at kids throughout the entire year. We don't just get one snapshot, we can look at what they do day after day in class. In fact, gaming the system in middle school math is negatively associated with whether you choose a STEM major several years later. So it's an indicator of not just how much they're learning, how are they going to do in the short to medium term, but what are going to be their achievements several years later and what kind of choices are they going to make. It's an enacted demonstration in these learning contexts that shows us what the student's real interest towards the domain is. Now, you might say, how much does learning analytics cost? How much does it cost to get these assessments? Well, the thing is that once you've built the model, it might be relatively expensive to build a model. It might take a grad student, say, a semester to build it. But once you've built it, you can apply it at great scale. And in some analyses of the cost of these kind of assessments, they tend to cost between 3 cents and 3 cents an hour for a student to $2 a student hour. And when you compare that to sending out somebody to a classroom to take detailed field notes, or better yet, put videos in the classroom and code those videos painstakingly afterwards, 3 cents an hour seems pretty good. It's much more affordable than existing methods. How can we use this information? Well, we can, once we know whether a student is bored, whether they're engaged, whether they're gaming the system, whether they're learning, we can study the impact of some of our design choices in blended learning and say, can we find out which designs we make that lead to less boredom, less gaming the system? We can then redesign systems based on this finding to improve the quality of blended learning. We can empower instructors. We can let instructors know when and why a student's at risk. So we tell the instructor, this student is at risk of not doing as well in the standardized exam, and here's why. Actually, they were getting very frustrated last night while they were trying to work through the homework on this specific topic. This other kid is doing pretty well with their learning, but they're getting so bored that they're not paying as deep attention, they're not processing as deeply. Guidance counselors may be another group that can leverage this information to benefit students, to try to figure out why individual students are not as likely to be college ready and what steps the guidance counselor, the student, the parent, the teacher can take together to try to help a student become college ready. Automated intervention. If we have a system the kid is using every day in class, maybe we can adapt to help students re-engage and stick the course when material is hard or boring. And we can do all these things to try to improve the sensitivity of our learning systems to individual differences between learners, improving learning outcomes. Early case studies suggest it can be done. The primary challenge in my viewpoint is to scale these solutions over the course of entire school years and to diverse and large populations of students. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me pass it on to the next speaker.
And apparently that would be me. Hi. So in thinking about this past year and what's been going on in our world of educational data mining, learning analytics, big data, schools, etc., I had some thoughts, and the first one was really, wow, this has been quite a year. I would say probably about a year ago, this picture represented fairly well where our smaller academic educational data mining and learning analytics communities were. If you look at all the nicely connected stuff down at the bottom, that's where we have what's going on in business, what's going on in academic departments in computer science and, say, biology, other places who are just going to town with that. And we're the little dots that actually Ed hid under where it says learning analytics, but it shows you where it is. We're those little dots right out there a year ago, not very connected. These days, I would say, are we perfectly connected? Are we right in the middle of that cloud? No, but things that have happened over the last year have made us, I would say, part of the conversation. We're starting to bridge those gaps, build those bridges across, get to know all people on both sides of this. And particularly, I think the rise of EdTech and EdTech startup companies is helping that happen even faster because it's speeding up the pace of what's going on in educational data mining. So another thing that's happened, well, this is kind of what school and educational data was looking like about a year ago, siloed away. And while our progress this year sometimes kind of feels like this, really cruddy, rough draft of how we might unsilo, and sometimes it feels like we're doing something like this, in general, we are moving to a space where data are being used in schools, data are being used by education researchers in exciting and new ways to improve schools and to improve learning for students. Another big change. We have moved from, oh, I promise all of my data is stored in locked file cabinets in a locked room in my office. In other words, a very antiquated system of governance of human subjects data to, it has not been adopted yet, but there is a very strong change coming in the proposal for the adjustments to the Common Rule, which is what guides IRB and human subjects research. And this, one of the main changes is that it reflects an understanding, not a perfect one, of course, we're on the way, but it reflects an understanding of how data are stored and shared and kept today. And so one last part I wanted to mention is just, here we're talking about personalized learning. A year ago, I wouldn't have thought that actually we would have as much of it going on as we do this year. Just in our state, we've run a study very quickly that was commissioned by the state. The whole entire state is using personalized learning software. And they wanted to know, we want data that's going to guide our decision making around using personalized learning software. So we ran a quick pilot. These are very, very beginning results, but found that several of our most common personalized learning software products out there have been helping students grow in math, middle school students, at a rate that's much higher than would be expected as normal growth of that time. Now, are we still left with many challenges? Absolutely. One of the biggest is methods. I mean, we're we're still in a space where we haven't quite crossed into the digital ocean in terms of what kinds of methodologies we're using for analyzing our data, for being able to interpret those analyses and share the results with teachers and parents and other folks. We're facing challenges in capacity building, talent for not just educational researchers, but capacity for teachers, capacity for principals, capacity for parents, and even students themselves to know, what do I do with all this data I'm getting bombarded with, right? Of course, there's the balance between privacy of data and still, access, use, all of those kinds of things. So we have many challenges left, but I just thought to myself, wow, it's been quite a year. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. So I want to start by framing the issue about putting the learner at the center of learning analytics, and talk a little bit about the challenges and needs. So we have ed tech developers who would look at a picture like this and say, wow, this student is frustrated about having to redo algebra. So let me build an adaptive system, and it's going to chunk the content and extract just that 25% that student really needs to learn. And so this credit recovery system is going to work with that student and teach them just that content. It's going to work with other students. It's going to collect data. It's going to show that data to the teacher. It's going to collect data across a bunch of different students in the teacher's classroom. The TED Tech developer is going to build dashboards that teachers can use. District administrators will be looking at the data, all up and down the levels of the educational system. Everybody's looking at the data. So we've got teachers then who are inundated with this sort of dashboardness. Now, what do they do with this? Well, so then we go out and create professional development for those teachers so that they can learn to use these dashboards. They can diagnose where their students are. They can personalize and individualize and meet the students exactly where they need to be. But what are the students going to be doing with this data? How do they react to it? Does it work to improve their learning? Does it work to improve their well-being? I sometimes worry that in the frenzy to build these systems, very well-meaning building that's going on, that we're getting to a mindset of one child, one device, one child, one dashboard. And I think that really is an impoverished view of what we could do with learning analytics. So this idea of a school of one, I think, should be thought of instead as a school of two, where you have an educator or a coach working with a student, using the student data, using the learning analytics results as a conversation for understanding and planning. So what do we mean when we say a learner model, and how might we think about opening that up? So learner models are computer-based representation. It's usually fine-grained data that's inferred from student actions. It's a particular student. It might be compared with other students or generalized from other students. It can capture skills, as we've seen, motivation, attitude. And the important thing, of course, about a learner model is that it actually has to be actionable. There has to be some support in that model for decision making. And of course, we want the computer to be able to make decisions with it, the teacher to be able to make decisions with the dashboard, and then also look at how the student might use it as well. So there's some promising technology trends that are helping with this move toward making better ways for learner models to actually benefit students. So I want to point to some work that was done and reported last year at AERA by Julie Marsh from the University of Southern California. She was doing a study of teachers, data coaches in schools that were helping teachers with data-driven instruction and data-driven decision-making. And what she found is that these teachers were sort of naturally starting to have students look at their data. And it wasn't just informal, it was actually formal school-wide events that would have students looking at their data. Students had data binders, they would have data chats, there were school-wide data Fridays. And what Julie Marsh reported in her 2013 paper was really a caution that we shouldn't just use the formative assessment literature, which teachers are familiar with, as a framing for work on open learner models, but instead continue to do research and make sure that when we are opening these data to students, that it's actually motivating and not deflating. Another area of work that's underway in learning analytics is in capturing the non-cognitive factors in learning models. Ryan talked about some of those. We're at SRI, we have an NSF-sponsored project that's led by my colleague Andy Crum that's using evidence-centered design to operationalize these non-cognitive factors. This is sponsored by NSF under their Building Community and Capacity for Data-Intensive Research in Social Science and Education. So we're going to be looking at ways that we can define general patterns for constructs, specific constructs that might fit under a larger family like academic perseverance, and then operationalizing those with learning analytics models. But what's important and what we want to encourage the group to think about is how we can actually then, and what would happen if we expose those models or the results of those models to students themselves. There's an interesting article by Matthew Jordan and Nikki Farr in a recent issue of Wired about 3 levels of meaning that you can use in health monitoring systems. So we have just tracking, we have ways of using data in health monitoring systems to motivate change, and then also using data to make better choices. But in order to do that, they argue, you need a situation where you are willing to give up some of your data in return for finding relevant information, finding people that are like you, finding people that have the same patterns. And they encourage a move from the quantified self to the quantified us. They list examples of things, websites like Patients Like Me, where patients that are struggling with difficult diseases find people, not just that they can commiserate with, but who can look at their data, compare their data with them, and possibly find some amelioration of their symptoms. So finally, efforts to teach students to use their own data and to support individuals who understand how their data is being used. I want to mention work that's being done at MIT in the Internet Trust and Open Portable Data Store systems. And I think what's important here is as we teach students about data, they become better citizens and better able to understand efforts like this where, as it was described in an October 2013 New Scientist article, the portable data system actually acts as a personal bodyguard for your data and not only lets you decide where to release it, but also lets you know who's actually requesting that data. So of course, in all of this, there are a number of research challenges. I won't go through each one. But it is true that even though the data is easy to collect, there's been estimates that actually building these models for individual systems can cost up to a full-time equivalent person for an entire year just to build out these models, so it's still very expensive. The models are also largely at one level. They're not integrated across levels. So we have these fine-grained model minute-by-minute measures of cognition, but they're not really hooked up with something that's at the level of a recommending type system that's trying to deliver personalized resources to a student. There's also, of course, the not much work that's been done on the evaluation of the impact of what we do when we expose models to learners. What does that do for their, as I mentioned before, their learning? What does that do for their attitudes? What does that do for their well-being? So finally, I just wanted to recall our frustrated algebra student at the beginning of my remarks. I see a lot of promise for ed tech and learning analytics and helping situations like this. We want to make sure that we promote not the school of one, maybe not even the school of two, but the school of us in solving those problems. And then I would just encourage us to make sure that we don't give into a situation where we're stuck with the pre-digital and that we don't harness what we can get from the new digital. Thank you. Check the time.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Wise. I'm head of the Alliance for Excellent Education. Our mission is very simple, that all children should graduate from high school ready for college and career. And to do that, we believe very strongly that in personalized learning as a means of, and one of the vehicles for that is achieving the Common Core and successful implementation. And so I was thinking about Taylor's opening chart and those points of how far we've moved in a year. So let me give you another year ago perception, which is if I'd gone, in my work, if I'd gone to the tarot card reader and she had said to me, Bob, there are two issues that are going to dominate you not only this past year, but going forward. And one of them will be E-rate, which I had barely heard of at the time, and the second will be learning analytics. I would have demanded my money back. Clearly it's Taylor or Ed or somebody else is going to be is coming in behind, and you've got us mixed up. There are two issues that dominate me completely right now in my organization to a large extent: E-rate and learning analytics. So let me give you two premises that I come to you with. First of all, that that without learning analytics and the full maturation of the field of learning analytics, the achievement of the Common Core state standards and personalized learning for all students, particularly those that are traditionally underserved, will not happen. This is a prerequisite for that happening. The second is that in the next 2 years, that much of the policy is going to be made at the district, school district, state, and federal level, but particularly at the district and state level, that will determine how well this research can be used. Is what many of you are doing right now in the field of learning analytics and what you're uncovering and what you're producing and what you're creating, will it be able to be used to achieve the goals of personalized learning for all students? Those decisions are going to be political decisions, and they're going to be made in the next 2 to 3 years. I think sooner rather than later. And so, as we look at what's an enabler, what's a barrier, or what's both to achieving this, and I'm mainly talking, I think there's a triangle really. It's practice, it is policy, and in this case, the public. And they all depend upon one another and all interrelate with one another. But so let's look at, first of all, at the federal level, issues of privacy, where we already have policy. FERPA, SIPA, COPPA, and which can often lend themselves to being misinterpreted. They're also all been on the books for a while, and how current are they in keeping up with modern demands? Some people use them to say, can't do it. Others take the position of, if it's not specifically prohibited, then I can do it. And so each of these has been applied each way. At the same time, at the state level, we have 44 states now implementing the Common Core state standards. And even those states that have not adopted them, or in one recent case pulled back, even they are adopting and implementing a college and career ready standard. And so everyone, and then with that comes the need for common assessments, a much higher quality of assessments. Most of them delivered via technology and online. And of course the issues of interoperability and what is it that you're able to share. And then the third is at the district level. Well, does the school district have an acceptable use policy, or does it moving towards what some districts are moving towards, responsible use policy? So these can be enablers, they can be barriers, they can be both, and sometimes show up that way. So there are 4 capacity components that are really driving, in my mind, this whole push and the importance of learning analytics. The first is the culture. What's the culture in the school? What's the culture in the school district? What's the culture in the state? How accepting are the educators, the teachers, the principals, and others towards not only the application of technology, but also particularly the effective application of data? Along with the culture comes the infrastructure. And so is there an understanding of what's necessary? Is it integrated with the culture? Does it respond to what people need? The third element then, of course, is the human capital. And these are, perhaps that one should go up front, because without the without teachers and school service personnel and principals being bought in, and making sure that, think about it for a second, we have 3 million teachers in our system today for those 50 million students. And so that's an incredible human capital challenge to get those who are leaders and get them out in front and to bring others along. And then the fourth one is professional learning, making sure that it's not just episodic professional development, but that it's truly professional learning. So these are some of the enablers that we need. And once again, why is this all happening at this time? It's being driven by several factors that are simultaneous. The recognition in every state that standards have to be higher, whether they're the Common Core or college and career ready. Second is the rapidly changing role of teaching and technology, making it possible for that teacher to be an educational designer. The third is the use of time, as states move more and more towards a 24/7 learning experience and also towards competency-based advancement. And finally, what makes this all possible is we have rapidly developing technologies and price points are dropping. So all of a sudden that Chromebook is the same, or whatever your internet access device is, can be the same as the cost of a textbook when spread out. So now, here's what can happen. If we need public engagement, what kind of public engagement will there be? This is a scene, I'll cite my sources, this is from Young Frankenstein. And so we have already seen some examples where failure to engage the public at an early stage can lead to bad results. The fellow holding the dog is advocating for opt-out, letting parents opt out letting parents have their students opt out of having these data packages, the full panoply of what a teacher could be using, to opt out of being able to use that. Someone else maybe in that crowd is very fearful of the cloud. You're going to be storing my child's information in the cloud. And what does that mean? And then the third, of course, is convinced that all of this is a ploy to just market student data to corporations for whatever they want to use it for. Never mind the fact that every time their child goes on Google, the corporations are getting far more amount of data than you're ever going to get out of the district office. But at any rate, so if we want to avoid every school superintendent looking out his or her window one day and seeing this, we've got to be making sure we engage the public. And so we have to get out in front. Right now, the PAC, this is the public. And and I would say at this point about 65% are not really engaged. But there are beginning to be some rumblings amongst parents. They know about the Common Core. They know the standards are going up. They're hearing about new data systems. And so they're wondering what's happening. And so, but unfortunately those of us, and I include all of us in this room and many outside, all of us, we understand about why we're excited about data, but we haven't explained what it can be. We haven't painted the picture adequately. And so the challenge is going to be for us is to get out in front of this issue, not simply to be reacting, which is where we've often been in the past. And so when I say get out in front, what am I referring to? I think it's important that we all be thinking about, in our respective disciplines, how we explain how learning analytics benefits a student and a student's learning outcomes. That we paint that picture, not only from the formal academic presentation, but also to that picture of what it can mean to a student or to a parent and why they ought to embrace it instead of being afraid of it. At the same time, recognizing that there are legitimate concerns, and that in this fast developing era of learning analytics and data use, and remember too, they're also bombarded with what happened to my Target credit card, NSA, drones, all of this, so that we have to be able to acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns. And so what are those policies that we need to have, and make sure that there's adequate transparency. We have to make sure and engage the teacher. The recent survey, Ed, I think you sent it to us. A recent survey shows that once again, as we've known in almost every other aspect of educational policy, the teacher is the most effective messenger. And so making sure that our teachers are bought in, understand, have once again the importance of the professional learning, and enlisting teachers in that effort. So that's how we get out in front of this issue and work with the public, as opposed to racing to catch up. And so finally, the road ahead requires several elements. It requires listening to what the public is concerned about. It requires the communication and the willing to listen and to communicate on a regular basis. It requires clear policies and transparency. And it requires professional learning and training for those who are going to not only implement, but also be the messengers. I happen to believe that the next 2 years are going to be some of the most exciting in education for a whole lot of reasons. Those of you in this room are going to be those leading that. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, first of all, thank you to everybody who is with us here on the final day of AERA, in one of the very last sessions. My name is Ed Dieterle, and I'm a Senior Officer for Research at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. On the discussion for this session, I'd like to say a few words and then make comments about each of the papers that were presented, and then pass the microphone over to my colleague, Taylor Martin, to invite everyone who is with us here to ask questions of our panelists. So I put this picture up to just remind everybody that a little bit more than 4 million first graders started school this year. And they're the class of 2025. And if our goal is to help these young people work through those 13 years of education from K through 12 and graduate, not just with a diploma, but ready to go into some post-secondary institution or into career, there's a lot of work ahead of us. At the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we organize our work around 3 different buckets. 1 around standards, 2 around effective teaching, and 3 around personalized learning. My colleagues and some of our grantees have had opportunity to talk about the first 2 during AERA this year. I'd like to take a minute to just unpack the third. When we think about personalized learning, first and foremost, we think about the learner. We think about the learner in relation to the important people in that learner's life. And as researchers, we are provided with the opportunity to capture and analyze information that may be non-obvious to teachers in order to improve the practice in their classroom, to support the learner on his or her pathway toward college, career, and the rest of their life. As researchers, fundamental to us is the generation of new knowledge and the validation of existing knowledge. One of the promises of learning analytics is the creation of usable knowledge, knowledge that can be utilized by teachers inside of a classroom. I think it's fair to say, at this point in time, the most dangerous experiment we as education researchers can conduct is to keep our methods the same when learning, teaching, and the data associated with both are changing. This doesn't mean to throw out the classical social science methodologies that many of us on this panel and many in the room came up with, but rather to think about the new opportunities associated with learning analytics. When Barbara Schneider approached me about framing out this panel, we talked deeply about who are the right people and also what are the right messages. We tried very hard to think deeply about the technical opportunities and challenges facing the education research community. And John did an outstanding job of talking about the opportunities connected with the digital ocean. Ryan Baker looked inside of his toolkit, and so did Taylor Martin, to also talk about what it's like to do the work, to roll up your sleeves and to get messy. Ryan and others also talked about the economics associated with doing this work. Taylor, on her last slide, talked about the cost-benefit analysis of different educational technologies. Marie did an outstanding job of helping us to think deeply about the psychological and the cultural opportunities and challenges associated with the School of Us. Lastly, former Governor Bob Weiss, who comes from the world of Washington, D.C. and policy and politics, helped all of us to understand a little more about the opportunities and challenges we have before us. In reading each of their papers and thinking deeply about each of their presentations, I thought of 4 questions, and I'd like to put these 4 questions in front of our panel, stepping through them, and then afterwards we'll bring them out to the larger audience. But first, like a question I still have is if we could articulate who exactly needs learning analytics? Why is this so important? The second is, what are the approaches associated with it? Third, what exactly are the benefits, the measurable benefits that we can imagine coming from the techniques applied by the people on this panel? And then lastly, what are the alternatives? What if we do nothing? What if instead of learning analytics, we look at some other emerging kind of methodology? So as a discussant, I'd like to first just put the first question out to our panelists and ask, okay, who needs this?
Well, I really liked what Marie had said, and I think it's very consistent with the kind of things Rich Halverson has said at Wisconsin, who I recommend very highly his work to everyone, which is to build systems in which the data is about empowering the user and using the data to be about making meaning in the construct. And I think students, when the data is appropriate, and the stewards of learning, which are teachers and administrators and other stewards, when the data is appropriate. But I think there's this larger issue of it has to be appropriate. And often what we see is the search for data to drive change rather than looking at the environment and what's the best data for that natural environment. So I wouldn't say everyone needs it. I say everyone can benefit from the right kind in the right way for those purposes, but needs to be aligned with purpose. We haven't talked a lot about the large variations in how data can be used in different situations. But I will tell you, I talked to a teacher recently who said to me, somebody in my family said, "Data is a bad word in my state," and it really made me sad because of the politicalization of the data use. So I think I've seen lots of times, and we all use data in our own life, whether to balance our checkbook or to make sure our kids can go to college or whatever our goals are. Data is part of the answer, but it has to occur in this larger socially appropriate context.
So I'll jump in, and I think that I would also like to argue that teachers need it as well. I've been fortunate enough to have been this spring on a bunch of site visits looking at the kinds of digital courseware that teachers would purchase if they were given funding to do that. And I was very pleased to see that teachers were being very conscientious about what they purchased for their students, but we're also very excited to have the opportunity. They naturally fit this technology into their classroom infrastructure with either a rotation model, center rotation, or pull-out. But none of them just thought they should park the students in front of these digital courseware systems without actually looking at what the students were doing. So after they would talk about how they would look at what the students were doing, they would try to shape what was happening. They were very critical about what was in the digital courseware, trying to understand whether it met their students' needs, whether they were special needs students or regular students. So I would really argue that as teachers kind of move to adopt these things that they're very excited about, they also realize that they need the data.
So I got into this because I believe it's the best way to ultimately raise student outcomes, learning outcomes for all the reasons that have been outlined here today. So let me put the student at the top. But then there's another group that needs this data as well, in the aggregate, not the individual, and that's the policymaker. Whether that's a school board member, district school board member for a 2,500 student school, all the way to the federal legislator or a president of the United States getting ready to propose the next version of No Child Left Behind, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And so this data, once again in the aggregate, this data becomes critically important about what works. We're going to make very sweeping, and already have made sweeping policy decisions in the next few years. Actually, a lot of it's going to be about implementation of decisions that have already been made, the Common Core, for instance. But and it's going to be on things such as what are pedagogical practices to encourage and some to discourage? What about the use of time? Do you move to a competency-based system? What's the data on how well that works? Do districts want to encourage their students or their teachers to be flipping classrooms, for instance? All of this is critical. And these decisions are not only going to affect millions of students, they're going to cost billions of dollars. And so this data and what learning analytics produces is going to be vital from the classroom all the way to the legislative committee room.
So I would say part of this for me has to do with the sort of whole purpose of all the research I do, all the research that everyone in my lab is doing, and that's really to get to a situation where we can help students really understand their own potential and be able to realize that. And so this also is selfish for educational researchers. We need it. So we have, as a field, about 50 plus, actually, let's just go back to Dewey. Since pretty much the beginning of this field, we have an idea that open types of educational environments where kids can really dive in, be active learners, be engaged learners, create authentic products, and some current examples would be things like Scratch or the many kinds of simulations where students can get in and they can do experimental design and we can collect data on how they do it, and it's a very realistic, authentic experience. So we've been going around saying that this stuff is great forever, and I tend to agree it is, but we don't really have the evidence base that would support that. And so we are leaving teachers stuck in a situation, and I so often hear teachers criticized for not using these approaches, but we're leaving them in a situation where we're not giving them any ability to defend or even just say, hey, I have this accountability system. I need to be able to say my students have achieved these standards, and I think this goes to Bob's point of meeting the Common Core standards if, we can't meet them if we don't do learning analytics. So at this point, we can actually create these kinds of back-end systems that analyze data on students' activity in open-ended environments, and then represent that in ways, and we don't want to over-dashboard it. Marie and I are in the same place on that, but create systems that can represent that to students, to teachers, to parents, and help them be able to figure out where the rubber meets the road, where this really fun, exciting environment actually is also helping me develop STEM content, writing ability, all of the key pieces that we really care about students learning.
When I was a doctoral student, one of our methodology professors was very clear to say that no research method works equally well for all research questions. I wonder if the panel could take just a minute to talk a little bit about when learning analytics is at its best, what kinds of questions can be used to answer questions, and maybe where it's not appropriate.
Well, I guess I would say that I think that we're still figuring out all of the ways that we can use learning analytics. I think it's premature to say where it's not useful, but one thing I do believe very strongly is it's not something that can be used just by itself in a lot of cases. We need to combine it with other sources of knowledge, other ways to find information. And in particular, sometimes we find surprising findings when we analyze big educational data. We don't know what it means, and big data in itself, the big data we have at hand, can't always answer those questions. Combining them with interviews, ethnographic methods, and other things to help us understand what we're finding can be a very powerful combination.
Yeah, and I think it raises a prior question about what is learning analytics and when are we doing it. And sometimes it's equated with large-scale work such as educational data mining. Other times it could mean more traditional psychometrics or other kinds of models. Other times it means general methodology around learning analytics. And some of us in a number of venues have argued for kind of a philosophy of learning analytics or a foundational epistemological base. Let me just tell you one story about a kind of data use that I really like that might broaden our ideas of what kind of data we're talking about and then what kind of relevant learning analytics. Katie Salen, who has led the Institute of Play for a number of years, has some game-based schools, one of which is in Chicago. And in those schools, one of the things they do is for their gym class, they have Fitbits or other types of devices in which the kids keep track of how much movement they have, so that they're collecting their own data about movement throughout the day. And then there's a interface. I won't call it a dashboard because I think it's more game-like, but it's an interface. So they're learning to manage their own personal data. Now, Bob, that's never going to show up on the Common Core, how much you moved in the day. But it's about some of the dimensions of empowerment that we want to be going on in schools that might not align with the most pressing knowledge and skills and ability issues. But I want my kids to be healthy, and I want schools to promote that. And this is the kind of way that data can align with that. What are the most appropriate analytics for that? Well, I think Ryan pointed out that there's lots of ways to understand that, but I just want to point out there's lots of genres of data experience and uses, and what's the best analytics will align with those needs and uses.
As a final question before opening it up to the floor, I would just like to ask, and Ryan started this conversation, and Taylor continued it, and others have touched on it, but just to really drive home, if you could spend just a little time talking about the benefits that you're aware of the kinds of methods associated with learning analytics, I think it would go a long way to help those who are in the audience understand why they might take the time to learn more about learning analytics.
So one thing I would say is that it's historically been very difficult. Teachers get lots and lots of information about a lot of things. There is a lot of things that go on in a classroom, and there are a lot of ways that students respond to their educational opportunities. Figuring out which of those behaviors that students engage in, which of the things that go on in their minds, which of the ways they feel actually matter for the longer term places we want to see students and for helping them become college ready. I think that's a key role that learning analytics can play, and that it has, in figuring out, for example, that boredom is much more strongly associated with outcomes than frustration is. That behaviors like gaming the system matter a lot more than off-task behavior. Knowing where to focus our efforts as instructors and as researchers and curriculum developers is very valuable, especially when you look at all of the effort that goes in classroom management practices towards addressing off-task behavior, something that has very small correlations to learning outcomes and even weaker ones to long-term outcomes such as college attendance.
I went to visit a school district, about 40,000 students, 3 years ago. And I went to look at the digital learning and the technology. And the superintendent pulled me into his office and said, Wise, before you go out into this high school, I want you to know something. I want to talk to you about the teaching first. He said, because that's what the use of our data is about. And he said, we don't view, when we're up on our game and we're fully using data, our teachers don't talk about them as being sages on the stage and moving to guides on the side or whatever, what is it, something in the middle. They are, and he used these words that are still in my mind, they are educational designers. Because now we've given them, they have the tools to truly take the steps to analyze literally from almost every keystroke of a student exactly what it is that that student needs, both to achieve their full maximum learning potential, but also where there may be problems that teacher can intervene in. So that's what I think the importance in is the learning analytics field only grows. It makes it even more possible for that teacher to truly be that educational designer.
So with that, I'd like to thank the panel, and now our chair is going to open up for question and answer from the audience. And since this session is being live streamed, we do have a couple of rules about that. There are a couple of microphones located in the room. When you come up to the microphone, if you could please just state your name and your organization, and then also your question. And also, please remember that questions do end in question marks. Our illustrious panel will do their very best to answer the question as openly, as honestly as possible. Thank you.
So yes, as Ed mentioned, if you do have a question, please make your way to one of our two microphones. Let us know who you are.
Hi, I'm Fiona Hollins from Teachers College, Columbia University, and I'm interested in the policy issues, the regulations surrounding the use of data. So, Bob, I think you mentioned FERPA, which probably most of us are familiar with. I have no idea what SIPA and COPPA are, but who needs to be addressing these issues? Is there some commission somewhere that's trying to address changes required in the regulations to permit easier use of these learning analytics?
We all need to, in the sense of we need to be looking and reviewing them. FERPA is probably the one that's people are most aware of and understand, although I'm always struck at the misunderstandings of FERPA because it's often used by different entities to say, well, we can't do something. SIPA and COPPA deal more with the individual right, but one's from the 1990s and one's from the year 2000. And so it seems to me there needs to be a very clear, there needs to be a review and a discussion that takes place amongst parents, teachers, educators, and policymakers about what it is we seek to do, and then whether or not these particular pieces of legislation meet those needs. I think what we will find, in at least the case of one of them, is that where the state of the art was and field and knowledge was 15 years ago, obviously a lot has moved since then. But once again, these have to be conducted in a very open manner at the in state legislatures and district offices and district meetings, because these issues are fast rising to the fore. My organization is undertaking a lot of this, so are a number of others, the Data Quality Campaign. I know there are 2 or 3 that I may call other organizations, because we're not going to move forward until people understand and are satisfied that there are adequate privacy and security protections.
There's also, I'll mention, an effort on the research side to do revisions to, as I mentioned, the common rule, which is really the set of policies and provisions that governs human subjects research run by all of our institutional review boards. Connected to they were considering many issues, but one of them was the change in big data and storage of data and sharing of data that came along with this. And that's through the National Research Council and a panel that's been going for a couple of years. They have a set of proposed rules out there. I believe it should be published fairly soon, and they'll be looking for comment. It's been recently published then. Yeah. Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom McTavish from Pearson. So I have this observation that Google, as they're collecting data on me, is largely hidden. I can put a plugin in my browser and I know that some activity is going on and I can opt out of a lot of things. But it seems like learning analytics, if we are going to really be transparent, we have a harder communication that we have to have, where we have to somehow convince the public that it's okay to be constantly monitoring and collecting all of these pieces of data. So there's that first hurdle, but then as well, I'm wondering about the general psychology that we are going to be embarking on in being constantly surveilled. That it feels to me that as we're living in this digital ocean, that marketing companies and educational institutions are collecting so much data on us, what that does to our general psychology. I was just wondering if there's any comment on that.
So you must have had the experience where you shopped on Amazon for a pair of shoes and then that pair of shoes followed you all over the internet, right? I've had that experience. I think that's one of the reasons I was so interested in the work that MIT Media Lab and the Internet Trust Consortium is spearheading around open source personal data stores, because it gives us the power, if we choose to use it, to understand what our data is being used for, and kind of puts a barrier between the people who are requesting the data and the people who are generating the data. You can actually go on Google. Google has a takeout facility that'll let you download your data. You can look at your browsing history if you've been logged into the browser for years and see what your diary of browsing history looks like. The U.S. Department of Education has an initiative called My Data that some products, some technology vendors have implemented that would actually let you export the data that's been collected by that tech vendor. I'm pretty sure Pearson, for example, has implemented that. And they're trying to encourage that not only for health systems, for Veterans Administration, Veterans Affairs, but also in education. So I think you're right, though, that there is a time that we need to disconnect, to encapsulate, to think a little bit more, and not be constantly surveilled and constantly monitored. There has been some work that was done by Alfred Kobza at UC Irvine, who studied the kinds of decisions that people made when they knew what was going to happen with their data. They were more willing, if they were going to get a benefit from that, they were more willing to share that data. So I think educating students and then teachers about smart uses of data, make them better data consumers, is the way I would want to see that go.
I think it's also important to differentiate the issues. One is what data is necessary to achieve the learning outcomes we seek for a child. So what data do we need, or does a teacher need? That's issue number one. So it's not just a random data grab. Number two then is, how is that data, what are the district and state's policies about how that data is to be used and shared, whether amongst educators within the building, outside the building, with vendors that have a contractual relationship with the district. That's about the privacy. And then the third issue is about the security. Privacy and security are somewhat linked, but it's where is that data being stored and how secure is it? And so, and here I think we need to have some very informational discussions as well, because there's a natural reaction to say, well, I'm not wild about my child's data going into the cloud. It's maybe a lot more, well, it is actually a lot safer than having that data sit in a 10-year-old server in the district office. And so, three separate, very important issues that have to be addressed.
I want to make a comment. I think there's another really fascinating thing that is going on in education and educational research and educational data, and that is the shift because of the technology. The barriers to entry to create data systems are very low. As Governor Wise pointed out, you could create your own server, you could put it up, and you can do lots of stuff, and it could be very unsecure, and you can get a lot of people in a lot of trouble. CIO magazine recently said every company is just one mistake away from complete, data problems. So I think professionalism in that area is very important. I think it's also really interesting. I've been in discussions where people will say, well, now that we have this data, we can just predict who's going to pass the class, or we can give a dashboard that says this crazy thing or that crazy thing. And there are no, right now, professional standards about how you communicate about someone's class progress. As we all know, the National Council for Measurement Education, AERA, and APA have very strict professional guidelines about what you can and cannot report to people, and people in that community agree to follow those standards. You don't give people data that they don't, they haven't been trained in understanding. You don't make claims about groups. I mean, there's just a lot of things that we take for granted as members of professional organizations, and as new professional organizations grow up around technology, we need to make sure we continue to evolve the standards that we've evolved in these organizations because of our long experience with educational data.
Great, thanks. Let's make sure we have time for some more questions. Right here.
Thanks to the presenters for a nice romp through the space of learning analytics. I'm Phil Winnie from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada. My answer to Ed's first question about who needs it is anybody who has to make a decision. And my question is, what do you speculate are the ways in which the loci for decision-making might shift as a result of the access to data in learning analytics?
Well, Phil, I would hope, thanks for the question, I would hope that per the example I gave earlier, there's lots of ways that that's going to shift so that students over time can have more data close to their experience to help them progress as they move through things. I run into students in a number of different environments, mostly in the college area, that are doing a lot of activity that they're not really reflecting on. And so if the data can be used to build reflectivity in how they interact in their educational environments, then I think that's great. Teachers also, we have to be careful in these digital systems that we don't create systems that actually separate the teacher from the student because the student's now interacting with the environment. So I think it's very important that sometimes I see systems that actually undo the relationship. And so I think it's important that we figure out how to build those communication paths through visualization or notification or whatever's the appropriate social context to bring everyone closer rather than separating them apart.
I guess one thing I would add to that is a great response, John, is that everyone's already making decisions. Kids make decisions about when to study and what to study. Parents make decisions about whether to send their kid to math camp or music camp. Teachers make decisions about what activity their classrooms are doing. Guidance counselors, principals, state legislators and superintendents all make decisions. The main difference, I think, if we do this right, is everyone will keep on making those decisions, but they'll have more and better information to make those decisions with.
All right, great.
My name is Bill Rickards. I'm with Independent Evaluation and Inquiry. I am an enormous advocate for the position that you've presented here, but I'd like to throw perhaps a little cold water on this by raising a couple of questions about infrastructure and meaning-making inside communities of practice. In my own experience with university programs over the last almost 2 decades, I have found that various purveyors of information systems will manage to create digital systems for student information storage which are as iron-bound and siloed as any filing cabinet you can imagine. And in fact, the technologies are there where the purveyors will claim that they're storing data and it's available, but that the accessibility of the data for research purposes is simply not there. And I'm raising a question about how the infrastructure for analytics will move forward through a better understanding of what those kinds of analytics are. On the other side of that is the notion that teachers, when provided data, they will analyze. That is, if you provide it, they will make meaning out of it. And in fact, I found the opposite to be the case. And in fact, I'm very concerned that the distance between a digital ocean and a data soup is very short, and that people are oftentimes inundated, as Julie Marsh said last year, with data which they simply cannot use. And so I guess my question is, how do we, at the same time, move forward with the infrastructure to allow for accessible, meaningful analytics, as well as providing a community of users with enough education, perhaps peer-to-peer, that helps them become users and meaning makers with these data?
One thing I would say really quickly on the last thing you said there is I do agree, if we just provide teachers and parents with a raw data stream, hundreds of thousands of data points, or the most simple visualizations, we're not going to give them the information we need. There's a key role for design among the education research community and the educational development communities in figuring out what are the things that matter most, finding out ways to communicate those to the right stakeholders at the right time in the clearest ways.
So, Bill, I'd like to take just a second to answer your question. First, as a parent, and then secondly, as a funder. So, as a parent, my wife and I, we have two small boys. One's in kindergarten, one's in second grade. As a good parent, of course, some of the pictures included my kids in the slide deck. But our kindergartner in particular likes to use a commercial math software package. And after he completes a number of activities, my wife and I, we get an email that summarizes what he's completed and then provides us with a couple of recommendations of how we might extend his learning out into the real world. Well, then my wife and me, we talk to other parents and we say, look at this. So I think that, from the parent perspective, part of it is just letting champions grow from the ground up. As a funder, we have a lot of questions, and at the Gates Foundation, we've very excited about some of our different initiatives to try and understand the questions that you raised. Marie Bienkowski is leading a study on teacher wallets to understand teacher behaviors around purchasing and then using technologies. Barry Fishman is running a study that's comparing and contrasting teachers' use of analog versus digital tools. We have a study that just began at West Ed to understand critically how teachers make meaning of information while in schools that are awash with data. So specifically looking at teachers' behaviors inside of blended schools. I think your questions are right on, and this is the right group to ask and attempt to answer those questions.
I would just add one thing quickly, and that is that co-design is really important. And in fact, there are springing up ways that teachers can be brought together to give really informational feedback to vendors who are building these systems, and to tell them whether the kind of dashboards or the data displays that they are building are useful or not. And so I think the more that we see that ability to aggregate so we can give feedback on this innovation is really going to help us go forward.
Great.
Hi, my name is Johan Lauderson. I'm from Pearson. I have a quick question about I think the success of educational technology depends a lot on how well it's integrated into the curricula. So, that really speaks to the fact that we really need the instructors' buy-in in order to make it work. And if it's well integrated into the curricula, we really get a rich learning experience. In turn, we get really rich data that can feed into our analytics, and we can use that to inform better teaching, better design of technology. So I'm sort of just curious about, we talk a lot about learning analytics and how it's going to save the world, but a topic that we speak less of is whether or not we just need to move ahead with the analytics and come up with all these methods, or whether or not something needs to happen in parallel to ensure that the engagement that happens in the classroom really works, that we get the buy-in from the instructors, that they don't push back. And I can see that sort of buy-in needing to happen on two levels. One is just the actual implementation of the technology in the classroom, but also getting the buy-in from that they really should use the learning analytics to either monitor the learning or their own pedagogical processes. And we haven't really talked a lot about whether that's something that we need to take care of as well, or whether that just will come naturally with more advanced analytics.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time, our organization does, in looking at school districts for examples of success and failure, because we want to hold those up that are doing well to the 15,000 school districts in this country that have major decisions to make. So let me just say, I happen to think you've got to do the buy-in, and you've got to do it on the front end, not the back end. I wince every time I see a school district that's got an RFP out for whether it's laptops, tablets, whatever it is, that hasn't gone through a systematic planning process with all of its educators on what this is going to mean. There's nothing worse, as you know, than a new technology showing up on a cart one day, and all of a sudden we're going to have an afternoon professional development session on it. And so it's about, to me, it really is about the buy-in of getting the teachers, the principals, and others not only aware of what this can mean, but also accepting it, and indeed, and Marie, I think you pointed out in an earlier question, also perhaps helping co-design it as to what the best application is. Without it, what we're going to do is we're just going to slap a bunch of netbooks on top of textbooks, and we're never going to get the kind of benefit that we can. The other part I'd make is this all has to, those of you in this room know the best of all, this has to be totally integrated. The learning analytics has to be integrated with the one-to-one device, which is integrated with the interactive software, which is integrated with the professional learning, and so on. If it can't, you don't just go out and buy these things one by one without integration, and I would argue don't buy until you've got buy-in.
So I'll jump in again about teachers, and I think that at least the teachers that I've talked to and seen in schools and districts that want to move toward a more personalized learning environment, and I don't think this is just the latest fad. I think there's a real deep need and a real deep wish on the parts of these teachers and districts to really engage their students. They feel like they're something slipping, and they want to engage them, and they see them engage with this technology, running home and using, making the goat dance and so on. They want that same kind of excitement and engagement in the classroom. And I think that also let's not underestimate how professional teachers really are, and the fact that they really understand how to do assessment. Every time you talk to a teacher about personalization, they say, in order to do that, I need to do assessment. And I think it's a pretty simple jump for us to make, I hope, from saying, okay, you want to personalize, you know that you have to do assessment to see where the student is. We can build things that will help you do that and help you make the decision about where to go.
Great, thanks, Marie. And thanks all of you for coming to our session this afternoon on learning analytics, sticking with us here on our last day of AERA. Thanks again to Barbara Schneider and AERA for sponsoring this session and highlighting it for us, and to our terrific discussant and panelists. So thank you all.